This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 566 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week was the first week this season where the players to potentially bench part of this podcast was not great. I hit on a couple like Allen Robinson and Tyler Boyd, but I missed big time on Kirk Cousins, and I missed on Damian Harris as well. The hit rate with that section has been really good this year, but those were two really big L's. As for sleepers, I'd say it was an average week. Kenneth Gainwell was the wrong read now that the Eagles are finally utilizing Miles Sanders more. You can hear more about that on Tuesday's 15 Transaction Show. But I hit on the other four players in that first tier of sleepers. Ricky Seals-Jones was good. Carson Wentz worked out as a streamer. Chris Evans hit as a super deep play. There were hits in there. I'm still having a tough time forgiving Taylor Heineke, though. I really thought that he was a slam dunk streamer last week. Overall, pretty average week. Before getting to this week's sleepers, though, I've got two things that I want to mention. The first is that I want to be clear that on this show, when I talk about a sleeper versus a player to sit, I'm not saying that you should start that sleeper over that player to sit. For instance, last week I didn't like Damian Harris. That was wrong advice. But I didn't really like Damian Harris. I thought Chris Evans was a deep sleeper. That doesn't mean that I would start Chris Evans over Damian Harris. I'm just mentioning players in that sit section that I'm substantially down on for that given week. You don't need to bench those players no matter what, though. You shouldn't bench those players no matter what because they're rostered in a high percentage of leagues for a reason. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the second thing. Don't forget about the FanDuel NFL High-Low, which is a free-to-play fantasy football contest. All you have to do is build your scorecard with the teams that you think will score highest or lowest in 4 stat categories. The closer you are to being spot on, the more points that you'll get. Players with the most points each week split the prize pool, and a perfect scorecard will win the jackpot. Head over to FanDuel.com today and play the FanDuel High-Low for free. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Admittedly, bye weeks are tougher for this show because there are just fewer players to choose from. But I'll do my best here, starting with players who are rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. Let's kick things off with the streamer that I talked about on Tuesday's 15 Transaction Show, and that's Tua Tagovailoa. The Dolphins have been a lot more pass-heavy than most realize this season. They've not only had the highest pass rate overall, but their neutral script pass rate has been the second highest in the league. Against Atlanta, I'd expect them to attack through the air. Atlanta's been the 5th friendliest team to opposing quarterbacks when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. And if you look at Tua's season, he's really only had 1+ matchup after facing New England and Buffalo in weeks 1 and 2. And he obviously didn't play that much against Buffalo. But in that plus matchup this past weekend against Jacksonville, he played well. He finished as a QB1. So I like Tua as a streamer this week. If you want another streamer who I think is a high variance one, you could look at Justin Fields. I know this seems like a bad recommendation at the surface. Fields has now had 4 starts, and in those starts, he's been QB 33, QB 33, QB 28, and QB 18. Not great. But as I keep saying on the show, this past week was the first time that he actually dropped back to pass a reasonable number of times because the Bears were in a negative game script. And it just so happens that he finishes the QB 18, where he ran the ball 6 times for 43 yards. He wasn't great, but it was at least a reasonable outing. That's what happens with mobile quarterbacks. When they drop back to pass more, they'll naturally have more opportunities to scramble. Well, in week 7, Fields gets the Buccaneers. Tampa Bay is facing by far the highest pass rate this season defensively, so we should expect Chicago to throw more. Of course, there's a scary floor with Fields. We've seen that in 3 of his 4 starts. But this is a game where Chicago more than likely won't be able to play things conservatively. And that's what makes Justin Fields intriguing. And the same goes for his pass catcher, Darnell Mooney. The Buccaneers are the 8th best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted points allowed, and they're also the 3rd best matchup for wide receivers. Mooney has seen almost a 30% target share per game since Justin Fields became starter. It's only logical to think that he's a decent play this week too. And I do think there's a real chance we finally see Allen Robinson have a usable performance. He's a lot harder to trust than Mooney, but we're in bye week hell this week, so I can understand needing to go to someone like Robinson. Next on the list, I'm going to go back to the Washington football team as I did last week, and I'm talking two players that I talked about last week as well, in J.D. McKissic and Ricky Seals-Jones. As I mentioned on the 15 transactions episode earlier this week, McKissic is just generally undervalued right now in the fantasy football world. He's seen about 15% of Washington's targets since week 1, and he's produced 3 top 15 running back performances in PPR leagues. In a game where Washington's an 8.5 point underdog, and with Antonio Gibson banged up, McKissic is a strong option. With Ricky Seals-Jones, it's pretty simple. He's taken on Logan Thomas's role. In 2 games without Thomas, he's seen a 20% and a 15% target share. And he's only run 3 fewer routes during this time than Terry McLaurin. Green Bay's been the 5th worst team at stopping tight ends this season when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I like RSJ in this matchup. The next tier of players who are rostered in 10 to 25% of leagues, it's pretty thin. So I only have 3 players in this tier for you this week. I don't want to force anything and give you guys plays that I don't actually believe in. The first is Rashad Bateman, who I talked about earlier this week. He's coming off a game where he had a 22% target share in the Ravens offense, and that was in a game where he didn't run a full number of routes. At the time of this recording, Sammy Watkins still is not practicing for Baltimore. That means we could see even more Bateman this week. And it's in a plus matchup against the Bengals, who rank 11th worst in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. Next in this tier is another 15 transactions player, and that's Ramondre Stevenson. I think we have to expect Damian Harris to continue seeing early down work, but Stevenson's interesting because of the receiving work that he saw in week 6. He had 15% of the Patriots' targets while running the most routes at running back for the team, and now he gets a matchup against the Jets. When you adjust target share allowed to running backs, the Jets rank first in the league. They're allowing the highest adjusted target share to running backs this year. When the Patriots faced them back in week 2, James White had a 21% target share for New England. But so far this year, every team that's faced the Jets has had at least one running back hit a 16.7% target share. It's a tough week in general, so I can understand why some of you could use someone like Stevenson. I don't think he's a slam dunk play at all, but there are worse moves to make. Tight end streaming is tough this week. I want to shout out CJ Uzomah in this tier, but I don't feel super confident about it. I'll be honest. Chances are Uzomah's going to be at best the number 4 option for Cincinnati's passing attack here in week 7. But here's the thing. Over the last 3 weeks, he's run almost the same number of routes as Tyler Boyd. He's also hit a double-digit percentage target share in 2 of those 3 games. And he's also facing Baltimore, a defense that's 8th worst against tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed, while allowing the 4th highest adjusted target share to the position. So I don't love Uzomah, but it's a tough week. I've got 3 players for you who are rostered in very few leagues over on Yahoo who could work potentially in week 7. Let's start with Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. He ended up running the most routes for Tennessee against Buffalo this past week, and that was in a game where Julio Jones basically missed the 4th quarter. According to Next Gen Stats, Westbrook-Ikhine ran the 2nd most routes on the Titans without Julio in that quarter, and he saw 3 targets. If Julio's out, I would expect Westbrook-Ikhine to take on a larger role in that offense. And that offense is facing Kansas City this week in a game with the biggest over-under on the slate by far. Whether it's a neutral or a negative game script for Tennessee, it's going to be hard for them to be super run-heavy against the Chiefs. So Westbrook-Ikhine could benefit. Ross Dwelley is another tight end streamer who you could target this week. George Kittle is still out, and the last time we saw San Francisco, Dwelley ran the 3rd most routes on the team behind Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk, and he had just 1 fewer route than Ayuk. Jimmy Garoppolo should be back this week, and that's probably good news for the pass catchers there, just because the 49ers have a better chance to throw the ball. Indianapolis, their opponent this week, they rank 6th in adjusted tight end target share allowed, and they've been the 3rd worst team in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So I think Dwelley makes some sense as a streamer this week. And then the last player, this is another deep one, it's Nico Collins. Collins returned from injury in week 6, and he ended up seeing 14% of Houston's targets. He ran just 1 fewer route than Chris Moore, who was 2nd on the team in wide receiver routes run. We could just naturally see Collins' playing time increase as he gets acclimated. And this week, Houston's a huge underdog against Arizona. Like a massive one. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the spread in that game is 17.5. They'll force the Texans to throw the ball a lot in a negative game script. And that may benefit Collins, who's not just a sleeper, but a super deep sleeper this week. I've got 4 players who are usually starters or borderline starters who I think that you might be able to sit here in week 7. Let's start at quarterback and let's look at Derek Carr. Carr's been playing really well this year. He's given us a top 10 performance in 4 of his 6 games played. He gets Philly this week, which may seem like a fine enough matchup, but it's kind of not. And it's partially because the Eagles have faced the second lowest pass rate this year. And that's turned into them ranking 3rd best in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the ground game do work for Vegas this weekend. After all, Philly's 4th worst in success rate versus the running back position this year. Now at running back, are we trusting Myles Gaskin? I know the matchup isn't bad against Atlanta, but Gaskin went back to his old workload in week 6. He handled just 29% of Miami's running back rushes. He did have a 13% target share, and that's going to come in handy to give him a decent enough floor. But are we really getting super excited about Myles Gaskin? Now, I can understand if you don't have another option. I mean, I'm in the same boat in that one league that I talked about a couple of weeks ago where I have Myles Gaskin. I have him in one league this year. But I'm not expecting the world from him. Melvin Gordon's a little banged up with a foot injury, and he gets a Browns defense this week that ranks 5th best against running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. With it being a short week, you have to wonder if they lean on Javonte Williams a little bit more. The nice part with Gordon is that he's pretty predictable. This season, he's seen between 44% and 56% of Denver's running back rushes in every single game. And he's hit a double-digit percentage target share just once. Given the matchup and given the injury, I'm not expecting him to give us a big performance. But you never know with Thursday Night Football. And then the 4th player that I want to bring up here is Tyler Lockett. It's painful for me to say this, but we have to be real about what's going on. He's not the same type of fantasy asset without Russell Wilson at all. Lockett thrives on the deep ball. Despite not doing much at all from a production standpoint over his last 4 games, Lockett still is 6th in the league in yards on 15-plus air yard throws. The problem is that Geno Smith has barely pushed the ball deep since stepping in for Russell Wilson. Just 8% of his passes have gone that distance. Russell Wilson's rate of throwing it deep was 23%. Now, New Orleans, their opponent this week, they've actually allowed the highest rate of deep ball passes against them in the league this year. But they've been 6th best at defending them in terms of completion percentage. I'm just mostly looking at this offense, and I'm seeing that I don't want to invest in it. I don't want pieces of the Seattle offense very much. It could be a tough season for them if Russell Wilson doesn't return. Now, as for the streaming defenses this week, I talked up the Giants on the 15 Transaction Show, and I still think they're the most traditional option. As for a deeper play, I think Vegas kind of works from the standpoint that they're at home, Philly's an average matchup in adjusted points allowed, and the Raiders are favorites. With so many bye weeks, it's genuinely hard to find a reasonable streamer. Because a lot of teams are streaming in your league, and that's risen the percent roster numbers. But the Giants are my top streamer, and then Vegas would be more of a desperation play. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. We got one more show this week, the mailbag episode. That drops tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.